In this lecture, we will learn about conditional statements in Python. There are times when we are programming when we need to branch logic based on a condition. For example, if the condition is true, we perform some action. Else, we perform a different action. A control structure or conditional statement lets us control the order of execution of the statements in a program. Essentially, a conditional statement allows the computer to decide which possibility to execute out of one or more possibilities. Which possibility is executed depends on the value of a Boolean variable. The first type of conditional statements that we will learn about are if, elif, and else. You may be familiar with some of these if you've worked with other programming languages before. The syntax for an if statement is first the word if, then the expression, and then a colon. On the line beneath the if statement, the code is indented. For example, this if statement will check if 1 is less than 2. If that is the case, it will print 1 is less than 2. When we run the code, you will notice that 1 is less than 2 was printed to the console. This is because 1 is less than 2. Since the condition is true, the code inside of or indented underneath the if statement is run. Notice if we flip the sign around, making the condition 1 is greater than 2, and then run the code, nothing was printed this time. When the condition of an if statement is false, the code indented underneath it is not run. Currently, our program is limited to just one branch of logic. Either the line will be printed or not, depending on if the condition of the if statement is true or false. What if we wanted to have more branching logic in our code? That is where a conditional statement like elif comes in handy. If you've worked with another programming language like Java or C#, you are probably familiar with the else if statement. Elif is Python's version of that statement and works the same exact way. In the event that the if statement above it is false, the elif statement will be checked. Note that any elif statements need to come below if statements. When we run the code, notice that 1 is less than 2 was printed to the console. This means that the condition for our if statement evaluated to false, but the condition for our elif statement evaluated to true. When I say evaluated, I mean that the expression 1 greater than 2 is checked by the computer program. It is converted into a Boolean value that represents whether or not it is factual. Since mathematically 1 is not greater than 2, it evaluates to a Boolean value of false. The same goes for the condition of our elif statement. Since 1 is less than 2, it evaluates to true. Note that we can have as many elif statements as we like underneath the other if and elif statements. Let's look at an example that supports more than just these two possibilities. For this example, we will start out with a variable x and give it an initial value of 6. Then we will have an if statement that checks if x is equal to 0. Note that to check if two things are equal in Python, we use the double equal sign. If x is equal to 0, we will print x is 0 to the console. Then comes our first elif statement. If x is less than 5, we print out x is less than 5 to the console. Under that will come another elif statement that checks if x is greater than 5. If so, we will print out x is greater than 5 to the console. Since x is 6, we know that this elif statement will be hit, and the statement x is greater than 5 will be printed to the console. But let's run our code just to double check. Yup, we were right. The second elif statement in our program was hit. Sometimes an if statement and all of the other elif statements beneath it won't execute if all of their conditions are false. In this case, it is handy to use an else statement, which will execute if the if and elif statements above it are false. By using else, you guarantee that one conditional statement will be hit. For example, say we have our variable x set to a value of 4. Then we check if x equals 1. If so, we will print x is 1 to the console. After that, we will check if x is 2, using an elif statement. If it is, we will print x is 2 to the console. Then we will check if x is 3, and if so, print x is 3 to the console. Finally comes an else statement. In the event that the first 3 statements above it were hit, we will print x is greater than 3 to the console. One key point to note is that x could be negative or 0, since in Python, an integer can be a positive number, negative number, or 0. But for the purposes of simplifying this example, let's pretend that x had to be positive. When we run the code, you will notice that the else statement was hit, and x is greater than 3 was printed to the console. Please note that there are other conditional expressions, such as Python's ternary operator, but these will be examined in later videos in the course. The idea of this video was to get you some basic exposure to control flow statements, with the basic ones being if, elif, and else. In the next lecture, we will learn about loops in Python.